The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
The freedom of a people to choose its leaders is the root of liberty.
Keep alive this experiment in liberty.
Liberty, in case you've forgotten, is the soul's right to breathe.
Government should be very minimal in protecting liberty.
Peace cannot be purchased at the cost of liberty.
The sturdy ground of liberty.
Liberty once lost is lost forever.
Fight for their liberty and for our security.
Guarantees individual liberty.
This great republic, born alone in liberty.
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 Liberty. Liberty.
Just how much do you want liberty?
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner,
a production of LibertyNation.com.
Cutting through the double talk, taking on the topics, going after what the politicians really mean, and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
The Democratic Convention 2020, Grievance on Parade. Welcome back into Liberty Nation Radio, a production of LibertyNation.com and heard from coast to coast on the Radio America Network. Doom, gloom, fear, misery, sickness, death, racism, misogyny, xenophobia, victimhood, grievance. That's about the sum total of the Democrats' message to America over 4 nights of their convention, that if they don't replace the evil bad guy Donald Trump with the virtuous good guy Joe Biden, America is sunk forever. We will consider the aftermath of the Democrats' 4 days on the stage, how it will affect or alter the presidential race, if at all, and try and figure out how Donald Trump and the Republicans plan to respond in their own convention over this next week. If you watched the first ever virtual political convention, you know the Democrats are presenting a dark vision of America in the Donald Trump era and hoping against hope that Americans' stated and personal objections to Donald Trump's personality will be so overwhelming that voters will roll the dice on a 77-year-old man transparently in decline. Joining us to consider the aftermath of the Democrats' 4-day run on the public stage and the Republicans' convention coming up these next days is political columnist Joe Schaeffer, who has done a superb job covering every night of the Democratic convention. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Tim. It's been quite a week.
It certainly has. So Joe Biden came roaring out of the gate with personal attacks on President Trump in the first sentence or two of his 24-minute acceptance speech. So it seems clear that Democrats want this election to be a straight-up referendum on the presidency and person of Donald Trump. Is this their best strategy? Is it a winning strategy?
I'm not sure it's a winning strategy. I think it's their only strategy. They have no uniting principles to move forward as a party. They've got this progressive establishment divide that they haven't resolved. Trump resolved it in the Republican Party to a certain extent in 2016, and he's reshaping the party. The Democrats keep pushing this fight further away, first by choosing Hillary and now by choosing Biden. The only thing that they have in common right now is their hatred for Donald Trump. So Joe Biden pretty much has to run on that issue.
Now, in the end, Joe, isn't the message delivered by Joe Biden really back to the future, that he'll restore normalcy defined as a return to the way things were before Donald Trump came down that escalator and stole the presidency?
It's amazing. I can't believe he's running on this after 2016, which was the big broom sweeping all this away. Hey, let's get John Kasich, who Trump destroyed in the Republican primary in 2016 to endorse Joe Biden at the Democratic convention. Hey, let's bring out Hillary Clinton, who Trump beat in 2016. Let's bring back this swamp uniparty establishment. That's what the American people are clamoring for. It's very tone deaf, and it's feeding its grist for Trump's mill. I really can't believe they're doing it.
Now, Joe, most notable among the few specific policy proposals of Joe Biden was a national mask mandate, meaning he intends to require the whole country to wear masks. Is this going to resonate with a public worn to a frazzle by this COVID pandemic?
Wow, that was spooky. And I tell you, it fit like a glove with the whole theme of good versus evil, light versus darkness. This is how Democrats are thinking these days, that they're enlightened beings. And if we don't go along with them, there's some kind of, we need to be coerced into the light. It's not just the mask. The mask is a telling sign of its racism, it's Black Lives Matter. It's, you must think the enlightened way we think. And again, Trump can run against this so easily, run against cancel culture, run against mandatory masks, run against these people in Washington, D.C. micromanaging your life. This is shooting fish in a barrel. I think the loathing for Donald Trump as a person is overblown. We have a controlled media pushing that 24 hours a day. This man is wildly popular with his Republican base. There are tens of millions of Republicans in this country. We don't hear about them because the media shuts them out. Democrats are not a national party. Donald Trump can appeal to a whole swath of the country that they can't reach, and they have done nothing in 4 years to fill that gap at all, to close that gap whatsoever.
Joe, as usual, thanks for your wisdom and insight into the political process, into human nature itself, which is what makes politics so fascinating. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Joe Schaeffer, LibertyNation.com. Quick break, and then we're back with Say What?
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Say what? Say what? Say what? One more time.
And now it is time for our signature segment, Say What, where we roll out a virtual assembly line of wacky, astonishing, damnable, and ultimately revealing things uttered by politicians and the chattering class. There's little question that race has played a major role in this presidential race, from the selection of Kamala Harris for purposes of checking all the identity politics boxes, despite her own dismal failure as a presidential candidate in her own right, to the persistent theme of racism and victimhood, which was the foundation of the Democrats' message in their convention, the unfairness of the country. Hardly atypical as a message from the left, but this time amplified as never before. For all the talk of the personalities and the speeches and predictable posturing, there's much to be learned from what the Democrats didn't say. Democrats never once mentioned two of our great American cities that are being burned to the ground by radicals. Not once did they even acknowledge, not to mention provide a solution for, the ongoing meltdown of Portland and Seattle and a mess of other cities, starting with New York, where a virtual evacuation is underway after unchecked violence followed a COVID wave that hit the nation's largest and once greatest city harder than any other. But the Democrat convention is behind us, the Republican convention coming in this next week. So let's drill down on what we've learned to date, with 2.5 months before the election on November 3rd. One of the questions is whether Kamala Harris is authentic or sincere, because this is a woman a majority of voters believe will become president without getting elected, because Joe Biden is feeble and everybody knows it. Authentic or sincere? Now, Kamala seemed to be neither in her own campaign, which is why she bombed out early, but she made one big splash for a minute by attacking the man who just picked her as his running mate, Joe Biden, essentially calling him a racist because he opposed forced busing in the 1970s and hung out with some Southern senators considered racists. But when she was asked about that moment by Stephen Colbert on the CBS Late Show, listen to how she sloughed off her newfound respect for the former vice president.
How do you go from being such a passionate opponent on such bedrock principles for you, and now you guys seem to be pals?
It was a debate.
Not everybody landed punches like you did, though.
It was a debate.
So you don't mean it?
It was a debate. The whole reason, literally, it was a debate.
So Kamala Harris is actually showing off her insincerity there, her shallowness, her opportunism. Hey, that was just a debate. 4 times there she said it. Come on, I didn't really mean what I said. Pardon me, but isn't that exactly what Americans can't stand about career politicians? Here's another takeaway. Kamala Harris was picked not for black votes, but as we've said here since Senator Harris was chosen, for those white suburban women who want to signal their virtue by voting for a woman of color for vice president. But those same women want low taxes and, most of all, security. Polls have shown that for years. Can those white suburban women really feel safe and secure when they see what's going on in more than 24 Democrat-controlled cities, foremost among them Portland, Seattle, and ground zero for the insurrection, Minneapolis, where a Democrat nominee for a state house seat, John Thompson, brought a mob of angry radicals to the doorstep of innocent white homeowners in a Minneapolis suburb and shouted frightening, hateful, anti-white slurs over a sound system threatening to take these people out. Just listen.
I'm a black man being terrorized by this Klansman right here. We are terrorized by the Grand Wizard. Y'all got the Grand Wizard living in your goddamn neighborhood. All the Klan exists in Hugo, Minnesota, and it's right here. Don't run now. Don't run now, racist white people. I'm here. Oh, yeah, we pull up. We pull the up. And we're here. Come on over here with your Blue Lives Matter sign. Blue Lives ain't shit. And if people in Hugo don't support black people, Hugo, Minnesota. I meant to say that.
That is so appalling, chilling. I debated whether to play it for you. But it's necessary for people to hear what's really going on, as opposed to what they're hearing or not hearing from the Trump-deranged big corporate media. Is this what those white suburban women who think Trump is déclassé want closing in on their comfortable suburban homes? Because rest assured, this type of menacing, threatening behavior will become the norm if Democrats control the country as they have every one of our great cities that are now on fire. Democrats have already proven that at best they can't control the violence, and at worst, they don't want to. And you know what's actually most disgusting about it? Virtually every person surrounding and supporting that vile, hate-filled, race-baiting agitator was white. In fact, the most remarkable thing about this whole insurrection is the number of white people anxious to publicly shame themselves and hate their own whiteness and their very heritage that's given them life and liberty. But then, given how they've been taught to hate the country by neo-Marxist college professors and the elite media, maybe we shouldn't be surprised. But an issue Democrats avoided like the plague in their own convention was the abject failure of their urban leadership over decades. But rest assured, Trump and his colleagues will make a major issue of it this coming week. And then there are black Republicans challenging Democrats in House seats in cities run by Democrats for decades. This week, Kim Klacik, trying to win a seat in the inner city district of Baltimore, drew a lot of attention for this ad taped as she walked through the ruinous conditions of a Baltimore street.
Do you care about black lives? The people that run Baltimore don't. I can prove it. Walk with me. They don't want you to see this. This is the reality for black people every single day. Crumbling infrastructure, abandoned homes, poverty, and crime. Baltimore has been run by the Democrat Party for 53 years. What is the result of their decades of leadership? Baltimore is one of the top 5 most dangerous cities in America. The murder rate in Baltimore is 10 times the U.S. average. Homicide, drug, and alcohol deaths are skyrocketing in our city. It's not just Baltimore. The worst place for a black person to live in America is a Democrat-controlled city.
You can be sure that woman will be attacked as a tool of the white racist establishment, but it demonstrates that serious change is brewing among black Americans, and not just because George Floyd was killed. Black people have seen the response of the Democrats they've elected for years, and they see as never before the wreck and ruin of Democrat-run cities across the land. And they've seen the jobs generated under this administration and the unprecedented effort by a Republican, Donald Trump, to win more and more black votes. Expect a reckoning of some kind among black voters on November 3rd. We just don't yet know what kind of reckoning. You'd think after the failed Russia collusion hoax and the failed impeachment and the failed attempts to take down Trump through people like Stormy Daniels, Michael Cohen, and Michael Avenatti, remember them? That the left would tamp down the insane conspiracy theories at least a bit. Far from it. They came up with a new one this week, as dutifully reported by their sycophants in the elite media.
Essential sorting machines removed, blue mailboxes literally hauled away on flatbed trucks.
Mailboxes being picked up and stacked up. What's that about other than voter suppression?
They're seeing some of their mailboxes in their communities uprooted. That's a problem.
People are worried about the post office. You're seeing, the mailboxes being taken away. Can we vote? What's going on?
The removal of mailboxes, the removal of equipment within the postal offices and the rest is to undermine the Postal Service at a time when the Postal Service is needed now more than ever.
The last speaker there was Nancy Pelosi, who actually called the House of Representatives back for a rare August session to deal with this dreadful crisis brought on by the evil orange man as usual, even though there is absolutely no evidence, repeat, no evidence that Trump is sending out vigilantes to rip out mailboxes. Fact is, mailboxes are disappearing all the time because we get less mail than we used to, so the Postal Service takes some out because they're not necessary. But the Democrats thought this would make terrific political theater, so what the hell? They've tried every other way to get rid of Trump. Why not a postal crisis? So here's a question for you. Just how far will Democrats be willing to go if it means the end of Donald Trump? We'll consider that very valid question when we return.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com. With one click, you get tomorrow's news today with LNTV's Hot Topics and Analysis, Liberty Nation Radio, The Uprising and Rabbit Hole podcasts, and dozens of insightful original articles. While the media establishment giants are sleeping, you can stay ahead of the curve with LibertyNation.com and get tomorrow's news today. LibertyNation.com.
Far more important than my political future and far more important than yours, the well-being of our country.
This is Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Well, the question has become unavoidable, if unutterable in civilized circles. With an election of reckoning, one way or the other, dead ahead, are Democrats and radical progressives willing to do anything to defeat President Trump? Or more precisely, is there anything they are unwilling to do if they believe it will take down the evil orange man? And this leads to the real money question. Would the Democratic Party be willing to trash the country, to be responsible for thousands or millions of people suffering needlessly and the system crashing, if it meant removing this plague on the land called Trump. On the surface, of course, this would appear to be an unfair question. After all, from the time America's first president, George Washington, voluntarily relinquished the highest office in his land for the first time in world history to the duly elected second president, John Adams, the party out of power has served in a capacity taken for granted through almost 2.5 centuries. The loyal opposition. This expression, loyal opposition, does not mean members of the out party are loyal to the person of the president, but to the office itself and the laws and institutions of this constitutional republic. Simply put, though out of power, the opposition remains committed to the betterment of the nation itself. Is it possible to say that about the Democratic Party circa 2020? The party still refuses to accept the result of a legitimate election 4 years ago, spied with impunity on its political enemy, concocted Russia collusion out of whole cloth, ginned up a fraudulent impeachment, and so many other things you can't even count them. Now it remains silent or supportive as the forces of Marxism, that means tyranny, anarchy, that means chaos, and nihilism, that means the belief in nothing, openly call for the destruction of life as we know it. There's a legitimate argument to be made that the forces behind this revolt, and by implication those who stand by and allow it to happen, are even worse than the Marxist revolutionaries of the 20th century who had the blood of hundreds of millions of innocents on their hands. Here's the difference. The Russians, Chinese, Cubans, and others who fomented revolution actually loved their homelands. They were tragically misguided, but they considered themselves patriots at their core. In stark and unmistakable contrast, the insurrectionists attempting to burn down federal buildings, rip apart communities, target police, openly profess hatred for America. They desire the annihilation of our way of life with no plan for what would replace it other than pure anarchy. Think Venezuela. These despicable criminals, emboldened by the tacit, if not explicit, approval of an American left deranged to the core by one man, have pulled off a double hijacking. First, their uncontrolled violence brought to a screeching halt the legitimate conversation on police reform for which the entire nation, was finally ready. Then these mostly white criminals hijacked the broader and equally legitimate issue of racial justice and set it ablaze. So now we're supposed to believe these spoiled, rotten, good-for-nothing white millennial outlaws should be the face of our quest for racial equality? God forbid. Donald Trump has done what any president should or would do in such circumstances, condemn the violence and offer federal assistance to stop the rioting, looting, and destruction of innocent lives and businesses and communities. But what has been the Democratic Party's response? Leftist mayors in more than 24 cities have not only refused or condemned federal involvement, but have said nothing and not lifted a finger to stop an insurrection by people transparently uninterested in actual racial justice, except, as with the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and the Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler recently, when they're forced to do so at political gunpoint. They've refused to call the criminals criminals. They will not round them up. They will not deliver justice to the thousands of people victimized by their leaders' reprehensible refusal to honor their most basic responsibility, to keep their citizens safe. They've unleashed an exodus out of urban America which, absent a sea change in this regime of virtually permanent urban democratic leadership, will leave those remaining in our hollowed-out urban centers at the mercy of left-wing extremists. And what about the life-sustaining jobs that fell victim to COVID-19? Democrats far and wide have made clear They desire to keep the country and the economy shuttered as long as possible. And oh yeah, they don't want our children going back to school either. They condemn something that saved lives, hydroxychloroquine, because Trump approves of it and declared that this president has the blood of more than 170,000 coronavirus victims on his hands. They perpetually fearmonger and ignore any upticks in the prospects regarding the virus or the economy, even as so many souls fight despair and depression daily and strain to make sense of this pandemic that's overtaken so many lives. As people struggle to come to grips with this not-so-brave new world, Democrats provide not a glimmer of hope, but only despair and unfiltered hatred. Now, this strategy may be evil, but it's not complicated. It goes something like this. If we scare people to death and force them to remain fearful and sheltered, call Trump an evil white supremacist, or lately Mussolini, according to the once respectable James Clyburn, and keep people focused on sickness, unemployment, and misery, maybe they'll blame Trump and vote him out. To hell with those whose lives have slipped into the abyss through this damnable pandemic. They're nothing more than pawns in the left's political chess game to take down a duly elected president by any and all means which avail themselves. The nation be damned. Okay. I'll admit that Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer probably would not fire an actual gunshot at Trump. But what beyond that would you rule out in their thirst for power? Take a while to consider. Are these the actions of a party of loyal opposition committed to a better America? As you ponder that, we'll take a quick break and come back with Talkin' Liberty.
Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
Now, finally, you will say, we're not going to talk about the convention in this segment, are we? The Democrats or the Republicans or anything? And the answer is a resounding no, we are not. We have reserved this segment for one of our signature segments here on Liberty Nation Radio, which we entitle Talkin' Liberty. It needs no explanation, nor does the man who once again returns to us as LibertyNation.com legal affairs editor, the constitutional lawyer, and the man we like to call our guardian of individual liberty, Scott David Cosenza. Hello, Scott.
With some happy news right up the top
happy
today.
News about Robert Kraft. Now, my first question...
A couple of good stories today, Tim.
You're going to do the Robert Kraft story, but you need to explain why you're leading with the fact that the owner of the Patriots has basically had something turn his way in a court case that a lot of people care about or not.
Well, we've reported on it for a while now. Robert Kraft won his appeal at the Florida Appeals Court. He has been accused of soliciting prostitution and engaging in prostitution. And the police in Palm Beach County videotaped him in the Orchids of Asia Day Spa, famously. And he's been fighting the production of that videotape in court. So they want to charge him with these crimes and introduce that video against him. And he has said that the way that the tapes were made violated his Fourth Amendment rights, as well as the Fourth Amendment rights of the proprietor of the establishment, the employees, and any other persons who were in the establishment. Okay?
Fourth Amendment being the protection against unreasonable search and seizure.
Exactly. So he won at the trial court level. That court said these tapes were made illegally in violation of the Fourth Amendment rights that he holds. In particular, Tim, it's one of the longstanding ones is the minimization requirement. So it's extraordinary for law enforcement to be able to legally capture audio and or video. And if they do so, they have to do what's called minimize, which is to only look at the stuff that is most likely to be the incriminating evidence that they're looking for. They didn't do that in this case. There was no minimization at all. The police, in fact, ignored the minimization requirement, which is why at the lower court level they threw out the tapes, and why at the appellate court level they also threw out the tapes. In addition, at this intermediate level, one of the 3-judge panel, which unanimously agreed that the tapes should be excluded from any evidence, also said that Florida law itself, in other words, not the U.S. constitutional Fourth Amendment protections, but within Florida state statutes, there are additional protections. Apparently, the Florida legislature is not keen on law enforcement using audio or videotape to do prostitution stings. And you might imagine, for a good reason why, right?
Yeah.
Because of the behavior that it might encourage. And so they've actually excluded...
Or exposed.
So they've actually excluded or exposed audio tape evidence by name in the statute, and one of the judges said that is also applies to the videotape evidence. So I think while the case itself against Robert Kraft hasn't yet been dismissed, I think it will be in short order without this kind of evidence. That's assuming that an appeal isn't made to the Florida Supreme Court. Dave Arenberg is the Palm Beach County attorney, the prosecutor in this case, who is a Democrat going against Kraft, who is famously chummy with President Trump. Mm-hmm. And, we're going to have to see if he's going to expend more taxpayer resources to go, Tim, for a third bite at the apple to prosecute this misdemeanor prostitution case, which, if we recall, all got started because of allegations of human trafficking, which never appeared and were never charged.
On to California, where a firearm magazine ban has been ruled unconstitutional at the Ninth.
That's why I put it in the title for you.
The Ninth Circuit?
So that you would have
Come on, that's a
reaction.
joke title, right?
So that for people who don't know, the Ninth Circuit, often and derisively called the Ninth Circus, it has the most... it's mostly associated with like the vanguard of leftist legal thought in the appellate courts. It's changing, though, as Donald Trump gets his appointments, and this decision was written by a Trump appointee, a Mr. Lee, who happens to be a South Korean immigrant, by the way, who joined up with a Hispanic woman to write for this majority, and in the minority opinion was a white lady, by the way. This is kind of funny on the,
let's apply identity politics right over all of these judges, since it's done with everybody else.
It's interesting. And, well, one of the things is where it kind of particularly applies here, Tim, is that Judge Lee crafted his opinion, and he wrote about the minorities and the rights of the minority, both political minorities and also racial and ethnic minorities, and that the state or government often does not protect minorities. And it is the right to keep and bear arms, the right to self-defense that the Second Amendment protects, that they can rely on in times when the government is not protecting them, whether that's systematically or periodically. And so it was, I thought, a rousing and really a welcome opinion. I think that, we've talked before about how the Supreme Court has refused to take any gun cases as of late, and one of the things that can really benefit a movement in terms of constitutional rights is a really good groundwork in the lower courts. And I think Judge Lee's opinion does that, and also he really lays waste to the idea that restricting full-capacity magazines or high-capacity magazines is somehow they're like weapons of or accessories of war, whatever the gun banners try, because of the millions and millions and millions of them that are used, in Americans' homes every day. That it's not some exotic feature, and that they are fundamental protections.
Well, if you add the word assault before any weapon, for all those millions of people that know nothing about guns, it makes them sound more scary, makes it easier for them to support gun control without thinking through the whole process. All right, let's stay.
By the way, we might see en banc review on that because it was a 3-judge, and then, obviously potential for Supreme Court review as well.
Now, the Ninth Circuit obviously has changed somewhat, but has it changed enough that this particular pro-conservative decision, as it were, would stand the test of the entire Ninth Circuit en banc, as you say?
Well, because the Ninth Circuit is the largest of the circuit courts, it doesn't have a true en banc setting like all of the others do. It's unique in this regard. In all the other ones, the entirety of the circuit will sit in an en banc review, at least those judges who aren't on senior status. But because the Ninth Circuit has so many judges, they don't do it that way. They make a selection of, I don't know, I think it might be like a dozen or 10. Actually, I'm sure it makes sense that it would be an odd number, right? So perhaps that's it. But in any case, it's much less than the entire circuit that sit. And I believe it's like a lottery-type system. So depending on who the judges are, they certainly do not assign those judges based on the president that appointed them to the circuit, Tim. I know that for sure.
Oh, certainly. Well, Chief Justice Roberts told us that. He said there's no Obama judges or Trump judges. There's only fair-minded judges. Now, let's stay in California, and we go to Oakland, where the fired police chief is filing a whistleblower lawsuit against the city. How come?
I thought this was a really fascinating story. The chief's name is Anna Kilpatrick, and she talks about how the Oversight Commission, the Civilian Oversight Review Board, was rife with its own corruption. And I just thought it was an interesting story because, like, well, who's watching the watchers is always the thing, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know how you correct for this, but basically she says that these civilians, anything you can imagine in terms of improper special treatment is what they wanted. So if they wanted to get out of stuff, if they got a ticket, they wanted to get out of jail free card. And if there was some noisy neighbors, they wanted more police presence in their area. They were pestering the cops like they were their, they were like stockholders in the police corporation rather than, oversight members. And so I just thought it was interesting that no matter what we do in a society to kind of put controls on the police and the governed, there has to be some control always on the controllers, or else because you'll just see that power accrues to corruption usually.
All right, the cop who allegedly kneed a subdued suspect in the eye 20 to 30 times gets qualified immunity, and this is a huge issue in police reform, Scott.
I just think we should talk about these qualified immunity cases from time to time. It's shocking how often they do come up, Tim, and I think that perhaps one of the best things that could come out of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests in the wake of the George Floyd killing is real reform of qualified immunity. We now have a situation where, like you say, this is a subdued suspect who was kneed in their eye 20 to 30 times.
It's just. I guess it was it not on video, so we can't see it?
Or? They did it. But that's the madness that is qualified immunity. In other words, because a previous suspect hadn't been assaulted in the same manner by the police officer, that means that this victim can't succeed with their lawsuit. That's what qualified immunity means. And it is a judge-made doctrine. This is not something that our legislature has weighed in on or the executive. It's just a judge-made doctrine that has modified the immunity standards allowed in law. And I think that we can all agree that it's not okay when a suspect is handcuffed to knee them in the eye 20 to 30 times and then have no recourse at civil law for the suspect.
Well, qualified immunity is one of those things that most people believe, majority of people believe, needs reform. And, of course, there's the national database of police misconduct that everybody also agrees is necessary to rein in this problem with police. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Tim.
This program, Liberty Nation Radio and LibertyNation.com's own podcasts, The Uprising, hosted by Scott, and The Rabbit Hole, Politics and Prose with our own Mark Angelides. All of them available on demand at LibertyNation.com and from fine podcast providers everywhere. So that is it for this week, and we'll be back at you next week, same time, same station. Till then, this is Tim Donner saying, now more than ever, stand up for liberty. And we'll see you next time on Liberty Nation Radio.